Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to take you through my full process of painting a stylized portrait in Procreate, from the rough sketch all the way to the final painting. This isn't meant to be a perfect tutorial, it's just how I approach things right now, and I'm always learning too. I'll share what works for me, what I struggle with, and little things I have figured out along the way. Hopefully, it gives you some ideas for your own work. And if you notice any mistakes I make along the way, feel free to point them out so we can all learn together. Alright, let's get started. Alright, first I start with a basic sketch. When I was starting out with digital art, I used a lot of guides, like the Loomis method if I had to name one. But nowadays, I don't always use them. I've practiced enough to apply them naturally without relying on them every time. As you can see, I've made my canvas size the same as the reference image, which helps me stay in scale and spot mistakes easily. That's it, I'm not chasing accuracy here. I just want enough structure to start painting. And honestly, that's probably why I struggle with the likeness sometimes. And spoiler alert, this one ended up looking like a completely different person, staring straight at the camera with a totally different expression. Anyways, I'm using the rough pencil brush from Masa Art. I'll link it in the description. I like it because I can build up the lines gradually, adjusting the line weight as I go. Once the proportions feel right, I lower the opacity of my sketch, then draw finer details over it, varying line weight to add depth. Then I set the sketch layer to multiply, so it blends easily with the painting later on. When drawing facial features, I focus on the line weight and think about how each feature sits on the face. For example, the eyes aren't just almond shapes, they're eyelets wrapping around a sphere inside the eye socket. I know this advice sounds repetitive, however, it really comes down to practice. One small tip is to draw both eyes together while switching back and forth. That way, you'll catch small mistakes pretty early on. For the hair, I prefer blocking it out as large shapes instead of drawing individual strands. Here, my reference has some nice curls, so I'm just trying to simplify them into such big shapes first. Throughout the sketch, I imagine everything as if it's sitting in the 3D space, and that really helps me build form on the canvas. And hey, if you'd like to watch me struggle through more portrait sketches to improve likeness, drop a comment. I'll gladly do it. Next, I move on to the base colors or flats. I usually don't color pick from the reference, I just try to eyeball it from the palette. For this step, I use the Tamar brush. You can find it under the Procreate's default painting brushes. I love its texture and it lets me layer colors really nicely to create that painterly look I'm after. If you're a complete beginner though, I recommend sticking to the basic round brush with pressure sensitivity in opacity. It's super versatile and you can paint almost anything with it. And actually, I'm working on a video about that brush soon. So if you're interested, feel free to subscribe and stay tuned. Sometimes I also use the lasso tool to clean up the edges, since the Tamar brush can get a little messy. But honestly, I think the texture makes it worth the extra effort. Once my flats are in place, I add a subtle color variation, especially on the skin. I use a large airbrush at about 50% opacity to build soft tones, depending on how vibrant I want the character to look. Typically, I'll add some red tones around the cheeks, lips, and nose, the areas with more blood flow. I'll also add subtle blue tones under the eyes or near the jawline to hint at structure. Then I lower the opacity of my sketch layer and start painting finer details like eyelashes and subtle outlines right on the flats. You can tweak this step however you like. This is just what works for me at this moment. Now comes shading, or really the main painting step. I create a new layer, clip it to the base colors and set it to multiply. When I shade, I try to use two tones, a cooler bluish color for soft ambient shadows and a warmer reddish color for direct shadows. I imagine this character standing outdoors where the sky casts a soft blue ambient light. So I mix skin tones with a bit of blue for those ambient shadows, then use more saturated reds for the direct shadows. Here's a little tip. Studying the Asara head really helps you understand the facial planes and where shadows naturally fall. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments. I can make a video on how to study facial planes. To simplify, planes hit by light equals highlights and planes facing away from the light equals shadows. There are three important aspects to keep in mind when it comes to shading. First one is hard edges and soft edges, then transitions, and then finally values. Beginner artists mostly tend to paint everything using soft edges, mostly with a soft airbrush, because if we just look at real life, we do not see any lines. However, it's really important to understand how light interacts with the different planes of the head and how the shadows are affected by it. In certain scenarios, the shadows have extremely hard edges, and in some scenarios, the shadows are extremely diffused. It's wise to keep a balance between the hard and soft shadows to make our painting more believable. Which brings us to the next point, transitions. These are the areas where the hard edged shadows and soft edged shadows or the hard edged highlights and the soft edged highlights meet. This honestly comes from practice and painting the face over and over and over again. And then finally, values. Or simply put, the lightness and darkness of color is much more important than the actual color itself. Here, I create a completely new black layer and set it to colorblind mode to check my values consistently while painting. Once a legend said, the lightest dark will always be darker than the darkest light, and it has been my go-to rule ever since. Now we are on to my favorite part, which is adding highlights. This step just makes everything pop. I start with the brighter colors here, and don't be afraid to push highlights. You can always soften them later with the eraser tool. Again, I study my reference carefully, watching where the light hits directly and how it spreads across the face. Just like the shadows, highlights also have both hard and soft edges and transitions between them. It's a really fun step, so take your time and enjoy it. At this point, I start adding final details. Things like freckles, extra texture, constant peaks, and color adjustments. This is where I really polish everything, kind of like adding icing on a cake. Honestly, I rarely feel satisfied immediately after finishing a painting. Usually, I'll take a break, sometimes for hours or even a full day, then look at it again with fresh eyes. That's when I noticed the mistakes I made before. For this one, I noticed it on my phone that the eyelashes looked too thin and fragile, so I went back in and painted thicker strokes to give them more structure. And finally, the eye fix. I realized the character's eyes weren't aligned. One was looking at the camera and the other was off to the side. I completely missed it while sketching and painting. To fix it, I duplicated the painting and made a new layer on top, then carefully repainted the misaligned eye. Here's a quick trick I use, and I learned it from Sam Designs. I hide one eye for a few seconds, then switch back to both eyes. Our brains are really good at spotting asymmetry after looking at just one side. It's weird, but a helpful trick for catching mistakes. In the end, I chose to make both eyes face the camera because it was the easier fix. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with how this turned out, but honestly, there's a lot I could have done better. For starters, I could have focused more on capturing the likeness and the subtle expression of the reference. This just ended up looking like a pretty, typical Instagram style portrait, kind of generic and safe. Maybe in my next video, I'll try painting famous people to really push myself with likeness. And that's it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, cheers!